Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to give you some different ways of looking at a phenomenon that's already common in literature, but is especially common in Middle-earth. A trend you may have noticed in the Legendarium is the number of characters missing one or both parents. In particular, you might notice that some of Tolkien's most prominent characters are grieving the loss of their mothers. If you're acquainted with the story of Tolkien's early life, you might not find this motif surprising. Tolkien himself was orphaned at the age of 12. He had few memories of his father, who died when he was 4, and his mother Mabel spent the next 8 years as the sole caretaker and first teacher of Tolkien and his younger brother. After converting to Roman Catholicism, she faced opposition from her family, who largely withdrew their financial support. In 1904, Mabel was diagnosed with diabetes, for which there was then no effective treatment, and in November of that year she fell into a coma and died. Tolkien would often later speak of the great influence his mother had on him. She was the first to teach him languages and encourage his interest in them. He also credited her for raising him in the faith he would profess his whole life. He particularly identified with the landscape and dialect of the West Midlands region, the home of his maternal ancestors, writing, "Though a Tolkien by name, I am a Suffield by tastes, talents, and upbringing." Tolkien's experience of the loss of his mother intersects with themes that often occur in the legends he drew inspiration from. Many of these tales reflect the historic reality that losing a parent to things like war, famine, plague, or the comparatively primitive state of medicine would have been quite common in certain periods. More broadly, it's not unusual for legendary figures to have something extraordinary about their parentage or the circumstances of their birth. This includes being abandoned or orphaned, or claiming a divine and therefore conveniently absent parent. So between its popularity in myth and Tolkien's own early losses, we shouldn't be surprised to run across this trope from time to time in Middle-earth. But even allowing for that, it's apparent that Tolkien makes liberal use of this device, especially when it comes to his most noble, heroic, or important characters. And the loss of a character's mother is often explicitly noted to shape either their personality or their whole life experience. Something that's all the more visible since many of the genealogies and histories of Middle-earth, by their very nature, tend to focus more on the paternal line overall. To show just how widespread missing mothers are, here is an incomplete sampling of the characters who fall into this category. Feanor's mother Miriel dies because bearing such a powerful child has taken too much of her strength. It's not exaggerating to say that the repercussions of her death ultimately caused the fall of the Noldor, and by extension, the whole plot of the Silmarillion. Under these circumstances, it is notable that Feanor's own sons end up estranged from their mother, who twice refuses to follow her family into exile. Elenwe, the wife of Turgon and mother of Idril Celebrimbor, is killed during the crossing of the Helcaraxe. Idril's cousin, Maeglin, will later get to witness his own mother's murder at the hands of his father. Though she would rather have stayed to fight beside her husband and son, Berin's mother, Emeldir, departs Dorthonion after the Battle of Sudden Flame to lead the women and children to safety, and is not mentioned as having ever seen Beren again. Turin's childhood parting from his mother Morwen is framed as extremely impactful, and his longing to reunite with her drives him to many of his more unfortunate decisions. Tuor's mother Rhiann goes to lie down and die on the Mound of the Slain as soon as she is recovered from giving birth to him. Luthien's death, the second one at least, is not unexpected, but it does cause the Silmaril she wore to pass into her son Dior's keeping. This kicks off a chain reaction by which Dior's daughter Elwing loses both her parents in the second kinslaying, and Elrond and Elros in turn are parted from Elwing in the third. Later on, Celebrian, the mother of Elrond's children, sails west to Aman after she is tortured by orcs. Other significantly motherless characters of the Third Age include Theodred, Eomer and Eowyn, Faramir and Boromir, and Frodo himself. There are probably plenty more, but I think we've shown that motherhood in Middle-earth is almost as risky as it is in classic Disney films. What's interesting here is that although it is a common occurrence in Middle-earth, it's not something that tends to be taken for granted, because in all these cases, some meaning is ascribed to the mother's absence. In fact, for two of Tolkien's most powerful and complex characters of the First Age, Feanor and Turin, everything from their innate characteristics, to their motivations, to their tragic flaws, tie back into this maternal lack, and this similarity is made even more apparent by how different their stories are in certain other respects. It is well outside the scope of this video to get too deep into comparing the two, but mention in the comments if you would like to see me take a stab at it in a follow-up video. For today, we're looking at 3 overlapping ways that missing mothers impact the stories and characters of Middle-earth. First of all, in many of these cases, a child will inherit some trait or quality that the text deems significant from their lost parent. Feanor is said to have shared both his mother's aptitude for craft and her obstinance. Again, this is in striking contrast with Feanor's own sons, who are described as not inheriting enough of their mother Nerdanel's patience and wisdom. 7 sons she bore to Feanor, her mood she bequeathed in part to some of them, but not to all. Lúthien's whole line is said to resemble her in their remarkable and characteristic beauty, as well as in their wisdom and spiritual power, all of which ultimately stems from Lúthien's own mother, Melian the Maya. Turin likewise has his mother's famous beauty. He was in truth the son of Morwen Elethwen to look upon, dark-haired and pale-skinned with grey eyes, and his face more beautiful than any other among mortal men in the elder days. Idril presumably gets her striking golden hair from her Venyarin mother, and her insight and nobility are characteristic of that people. Maeghlin, the son of the Noldoran Arthel and the dark elf Eol, resembled in face and form rather his kindred of the Noldor, but in mood and mind he was the son of his father. Yet it is said that Maeghlin loved his mother better, and if Eol were abroad, he would sit long beside her and listen to all that she could tell him of her kin and their deeds in Eldamar, and of the might and valor of the princes of the house of Fingolfin. Arthel also leaves her son with a secret Quenya name, given and used by her alone. Boromir and Faramir lose their mother Finduilas at the ages of 10 and 5, respectively. While the link is not made explicit, the gentleness that distinguishes Faramir from the father he outwardly resembles is a trait he shares with Finduilas, who was a lady of great beauty and gentle heart. The second trend to notice is that separation from a mother is often what creates the circumstances that determine key events of the plot. For instance, the role of Rhiann, the mother of Tuor, is to carry her unborn son out of Dor-lómin, leave him in the care of Anil and his wandering band of Grey Elves, and then to exit the tale via fatally broken heart, which, while understandable, is also quite convenient to the story. Although Tuor has no memory of her, his unusual upbringing is a product of her actions and her death. Theoden's wife Elfhild dies in childbirth, and later on his sister Theodwyn succumbs to illness, which leaves the king not only a single parent to his own son, but adoptive father to his orphaned niece and nephew, who as a result adore their uncle with an intensity that motivates much of their actions in The Lord of the Rings. Frodo is a similar case. He finds himself at the forefront of a doomed quest to save the world, all because he was adopted by Bilbo after his parents' death, and made the heir to Bag End and all its contents, including the One Ring. Given Maeglin's fondness for his mother, we can assume he grieved her loss, but the traumatic and highly inauspicious circumstances surrounding Aradhel's death are arguably more important to his story than whatever sorrow it may have provoked. Aradhel's death and Eol's execution leave Maeghlin not only orphaned, but totally alone in a society he has no idea how to navigate, trapped indefinitely in a city he's never seen before, cursed by the father whose execution he witnessed in stony silence, and viewed with pity but also a degree of mistrust by the family members he is just now meeting for the first time. Beron's case is a mirror image of Maeglin's, in that his grief itself is what creates the necessary conditions for the next stage of his story. Beron's parting from Imeldir, mentioned only briefly, is but the first drop in the torrential downpour of disasters that will befall him as a product of the Dagor Bragollach. By the time he meets Luthien, he has lost not only his mother, but also his father, the rest of his family, his companions, his entire people, and his homeland. The overwhelming grief he's already endured sets the stage for the transcendent love he bears for Luthien, and the single-mindedness with which he pursues the quest Thingol sets for him. Beron's descendants will suffer similar losses at the hands of the increasingly violent events of the latter days of the First Age. Beron and Luthien's own death, that is the one that sticks, is unwitnessed, and its primary effect is to put their Silmaril in the hands of their son Dior, who is moved by the memory of his parents' sacrifice to deny the requests of the Feanorians. In the ensuing kinslaying, that is number 2 for those of you keeping track at home, Dior and Nimloth are both slain, leaving their small daughter Elwing as both an orphan on the run and the tiny heir of a jewel that has definitely got some doomed energy at this point, and what's more is still set in a necklace that is indisputably accursed. When Elwing, in her turn, is faced with the regrettable consequences of Noldoran tenacity, her spontaneous birdification leaves her sons to be fostered by the remaining Feanorians. I have elsewhere argued that the effects of this event, along with that of, half a dozen other completely unwarranted personal tragedies, are implicitly present in later characterizations of Elrond, but as far as I know, Elrond's grief for his parents is not explicitly mentioned as determining his personality or his decisions. As far as the narrative is concerned, what's really important to remember about the third kinslaying is that as a result, Eärendil, Elwing, and their Silmaril all make it to Valinor, but their offspring remain alive, though maybe not well, in Middle-earth. The final way missing mothers impact Middle-earth is when the loss of a mother is either directly or indirectly shown to be critical in a psychological understanding of a character's nature, motives, and decisions. Again, Feanor and Turin are both standout examples of this, and also again, a full exploration of how this element influences them is not something I want to attempt here. But some of the possible consequences for Feanor include the intensity with which he loves his father, his resentment of his half-siblings, the readiness with which he believes the Valar might hold ulterior motives, and his fatal underestimation of their relative power, the complicated dynamics of Feanor's own marriage, the thematic mirroring of the dangers of creation and of procreation, and the approach he takes to parenting his sons. Turin's mother Morwen is fascinatingly complex both as a character and in the ways she relates to her son. Her protective love of her children exists alongside her personal pride and her intolerance of any expressions of vulnerability. Turin, for his part, never seems to get over the high standards his mother sets for him, the trauma of having to leave her behind and seek safety in Doriath, the hurt he must have felt when she repeatedly declined invitations to join him there, and the haunting sense of duty he feels toward the women of Dorlomin generally. In the body of The Lord of the Rings, Faramir's mother is mentioned once, but it is in a very significant moment, when he wraps Éowyn in his mother's mantle just before their first defiant kiss on the walls of Minas Tirith. The mantle was wrought for his mother, Finduilas of Amroth, who died untimely, and was to him but a memory of loveliness in far days and of his first grief, and her robe seemed to him raiment fitting for the beauty and sadness of Éowyn. Appendix A explains how her death may also have impacted her sons in other, less direct ways. After her death, Denethor became more grim and silent than before, and would sit long alone in his tower deep in thought. It was afterward believed that, needing knowledge but being proud, and trusting in his own strength of will, he dared look in the Palantir of the White Tower. Both Denethor's general increase in grimness and his decision to start using the Palantir will shape the course of his relationship with both his sons. The case of Turgon, Elenwe, and Idril is comparable. We can assume Idril deeply mourned her mother, but we are told more about the tragedy's effects on Turgon. In a late description of Finwë's descendants, Tolkien relates that both Elenwe and Idril fell through the ice while crossing the Helcaraxe, and Turgon was only able to rescue Idril, nearly dying himself in the attempt. Tolkien reports Turgon was thereafter unappeasable in his enmity for Feanor and his sons, and it's not hard to see how the loss of his wife, along with his young daughter's close call, could contribute to his craving for stability and security, his regretful longing for Tirion, and the extreme measures he takes to ensure Gondolin's concealment. He seems particularly protective of his daughter and younger sister, a tendency that will prove consequential for them both. For Elrond's sons, Elladan and Elrohir, Celebrian's departure is acknowledged as a prime motivator for their habitual errantry, for they rode often far afield with the Rangers of the North, forgetting never their mother's torment in the dens of the orcs. By contrast, little is directly stated about Arwen's reaction to her mother's unfortunate fate, but the recorded attitudes of her brother and father are suggestive of at least one way it may have affected her. Upon their first meeting, Aragorn comments, somewhat playfully, that her very existence must have been a close-guarded secret indeed. "Often is it seen," said Aragorn, "that in dangerous days men hide their chief treasure. Yet I marvel at Elrond and your brothers, for though I have dwelt in this house from childhood, I have heard no word of you. How comes it that we have never met before? Surely your father has not kept you locked in his hoard." Although painful to recount, young Aragorn's attempts at rizzing Arwen up do contain a grain of truth. Given how close they are to Aragorn in other respects, it is surprising that neither Elrond nor his sons would bother to even mention Arwen's existence, much less introduce her upon her return. This reticence could indicate that the natural concern Arwen's father and brothers doubtless felt for her might have been intensified by the memory of Celebrian's capture and subsequent voyage west. Aragorn's own mother, Gilrain, seemingly bucks the trend of tragic maternal loss. After Aragorn's father is killed and she relocates to Rivendell with her young son, Gilrain goes on to live a relatively peaceful life. However, her final parting from her son is quite a painful one, for as she claims, "I am aged by care, even as one of lesser men, and now that it draws near I cannot face the darkness of our time that gathers upon Middle-earth. I shall leave it soon." Aragorn, who has been charged with overcoming said darkness, is naturally resistant to this message. Aragorn tried to comfort her, saying, "Yet there may be a light beyond the darkness, and if so, I would have you see it, and be glad." But she answered only with this linod, "Onan I estel edain, ucheben estel amin." This is glossed as meaning, "I gave hope to the Dunedain, I have kept no hope for myself," a phrase that gets really painful when you realize Aragorn's childhood name was Estel, or Hope, and that furthermore his trips to visit his mother have become increasingly infrequent, as he spends more and more time traveling around Middle-earth, trying to fulfill his destiny and redeem his people. The story continues unsurprisingly that after hearing this, Aragorn went away heavy of heart. Gilrain died before the next spring. Another case where a departed mother's influence might be more important than it first appears is Bilbo. In The Hobbit, the death of Bilbo's parents is mainly brought up to explain the very comfortable home and lifestyle he enjoys before his adventure. His mother, who was known as the celebrated Belladonna Took before she became Mrs. Bungo Baggins, outlives her husband by 8 years and dies at the fairly respectable age of 82. Though we might note that this still seems a bit early by Hobbit standards, especially since Tooks, as a rule, are famously long-lived. Still, at 44, the son she leaves behind is hardly a vulnerable child. But at least one consequence of her death is expressed symbolically in Bilbo himself, who is described as having repressed all of his Tookish traits. Gandalf expresses disappointment in the self-satisfied person Bilbo has become by invoking his mother. "To think that I should have lived to be good-morninged by Belladonna Took's son as if I was selling buttons at the door." Bilbo's decision to join the quest of Erebor is framed as the reawakening of his Took side, symbolically reclaiming the disreputable legacy of his mother's kin, which he had almost killed off in himself before Gandalf's, little nudge out the door. Just like Belladonna's latent influence on Bilbo, the legacy of Frodo's mother, Primula Brandybuck, can be detected in some important parts of his character and experiences. After his parents' accidental deaths, Frodo is initially raised among his mother's relatives in the regular warren of Brandy Hall. Though Frodo is also related to Bilbo through their shared Brandybuck and Took ancestors, the inhabitants of Hobbiton view his move to Bag End as a reclamation of sorts by the Baggins side of the family, and as a necessary corrective measure. Even mad Bilbo Baggins is apparently a more civilizing influence than Frodo's outlandish Buckland cousins. Frodo seems relatively unfazed by the rumors surrounding his parents' death, Bilbo's shady foreign investments, and his own questionable Brandybuck connections, but they all mark him as something of an outsider, and when he inherits Bag End, Lobelia Sackville Baggins openly tells him, "You don't belong here, you're no Baggins, you're a Brandybuck." To be fair to Lobelia, even before the ring's identity is revealed, Frodo's initial satisfaction at being the Mr. Baggins of Bag End is already losing out to the decidedly un-Bagginsly restlessness he shares with Bilbo, an experience that prepares him to accept his dangerous quest in the first place, and a foreshadowing of what his ultimate fate will be. Grief is an experience common to all of humanity, and when it affects relationships as critical as the one between parent and child, the results can be, well, dramatic. So it's to be expected that we find the theme of missing mothers explored and exploited in all kinds of stories, so much so that it can become cliché, a cheap way to inject drama, flesh out a backstory, or move the plot along. But while Tolkien uses this trope liberally, that doesn't mean he uses it thoughtlessly. The legacies left by Middle-earth's absent mothers are varied and complex, sometimes understated, but never entirely overlooked. If you enjoyed exploring all the ways this inherently tragic topic appears in Tolkien's writings, like the video with the desperate intensity of a final farewell. If you prefer your melancholy Middle-earth lore delivered with a side of overthinking and a delicate sprinkle of sarcasm, you should consider subscribing, or check out the bonuses and benefits on my Patreon page, which is linked in the description. Thank you to everyone for listening, especially my patrons, including Seven-Eyed, Uwu Iluvatar, Emperor Kane, Rico Mariani, Perhail the Gardener, Amar, Catherine Berry, Dr. Newton Wen, Steve B., John H. Austin Jr., James A. McCormick, Nick Rialo, Jeremy Buckingham, Dorwin Gray, Zach Burns, Brendan Mooney, E. Rose B., Allison Kreutzberg, and Joel Bion.